In March of 1985, an estimated 350,000 college students arrived on 6 miles of beach in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, within the span of a single week. They spent close to $120 million in that week. They generated more than 2,500 arrests. They filled hotel rooms built for 2 with 6, sometimes 8, and turned a strip of coastline barely longer than a half marathon into the most concentrated seasonal migration of young people anywhere in the United States. A pattern that had built for nearly 2 decades by the time it reached that peak. That same year, the city's own mayor stood in front of national television cameras and told all of them not to come back. Today, the same 6 miles of sand hold superyachts where the students once slept in cars, and a beach that used to measure its spring by an arrest count now measures it by something else entirely. This is the story of an American city that spent 20 years building its name on a single chaotic week, and then made the deliberate decision to erase it. Chapter 1. The name that outlasted the fort. The story of that erased spring did not begin with a beach full of college students, or a mayor with a grudge and a microphone. It began with a river mouth that, for most of recorded history, belonged to no one in particular. Before 1838, the 6 miles of coastline that would one day hold 500,000 spring breakers in a single week held mangrove swamp and a low ridge of ancient coral rock, cut through by the New River on its way to the Atlantic. There was no dock, no road reached it, and no town had ever stood there. Only the seasonal camps of Seminole families, who moved through the hammocks and sawgrass on their own calendar, long before anyone with a survey map thought to give the place a name. The Army gave it one first. On March 6, 1838, in the middle of the Second Seminole War, Major William Lauderdale and 200 Tennessee volunteers built a wooden stockade on the river's north bank, a forward post meant to run supply and pursuit against Seminole resistance fighters retreating deeper into the Everglades. General Thomas Jessup, commanding the campaign, named the post for Lauderdale. It did not last. The garrison relocated the fort twice in 4 years, chasing a war that kept moving south and west, and by 1842, the post was abandoned outright. No settlers followed the soldiers in. For the next 50 years, the coral ridge and the mangroves took the site back, and the only name attached to it belonged to a fort that no longer existed. Enter Frank Stranahan. He was Ohio-born, and his 20s were not spent looking for Florida. They were spent in a Youngstown steel mill until the work damaged his lungs badly enough that he left the state entirely in 1890, chasing cleaner air south. He landed in Melbourne, Florida, clerking in the mercantile store of his cousin Guy Metcalf. It was Metcalf who, in January of 1893, sent 27-year-old Stranahan south to run a ferry crossing and trading camp on the New River, a posting so remote that the settlement there, by every account that survives, numbered a handful of families at most. No railroad reached it yet. There was nothing resembling a town, just a river crossing, a handful of Seminole trading partners, and Stranahan's decision to deal with them fairly. That decision built him a reputation that would outlast the trading camp itself. The railroad arrived in 1896, when Henry Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway pushed its line down through the scrub to the New River crossing. Stranahan expanded with it, a general store first, then a small bank operating out of the same building, credit and goods run by the same man at the same counter. In 1901, he replaced the original trading post with a 2-story building on the riverbank, built to hold both business lines under one roof. That building is still standing. It would outlive the man who built it, the industry that came after him, and the name Fort Lauderdale itself would eventually need something to be older than. The city took that name formally in 1911, when Fort Lauderdale incorporated, borrowing for its charter, the name of a stockade that had been gone for nearly 70 years, built by a Tennessee militia that had stayed less than 4. 4 years later, in 1915, the Florida legislature carved Broward County out of the surrounding territory, naming it for Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, a governor whose signature achievement had nothing to do with forts or ferries, draining the Everglades, acre by acre, to make swampland sellable. The county was organized from its first year around a single idea: that the swamp Stranahan had crossed by ferry was, in the right hands, real estate. Those hands had not shown up yet. Within 5 years they would, with dredges instead of ferries, and a plan borrowed from a city on the other side of the Atlantic. Chapter 2. The Venice of America. The hands arrived in 1920, and they arrived with dredges. A syndicate of local developers had already staked a claim to the mangrove flats east of the New River. Soft ground tidal, worth nothing to anyone who could not drain it. And what they needed was someone who could turn swamp into shoreline without waiting for nature to do it on its own schedule. They hired Charles Rhodes. Rhodes was an engineer who had spent time studying the canal system of Venice, Italy. And what he brought back from that study was not the architecture but the arithmetic. A city built out of water frontage is a city that can sell the same acre of swamp 4 or 5 times over. Once for every foot of new coastline, a dredge is willing to cut into it. The syndicate's contract with Rhodes committed real money to dredging before a single lot went up for sale. A bet that the swamp was worth more cut into channels than it had ever been worth whole. The dredges went to work east of the young downtown, and what came up out of the muck was not filled land in any ordinary sense. It was engineered land, narrow fingers of fill, dredged into shape and packed just high enough to keep a foundation dry on a calm day, with water cut in on 2 or 3 sides of every lot the developers platted. The material that raised each finger above the tide line was the same material scooped from the channel running beside it. Canal and land, in other words, were made from each other in a single motion of the same dredge on the same afternoon. Each finger ran narrow, water on both sides, a single row of home sites down the spine of it. A shape built for selling frontage, not for standing against weather. By the time the last fingers were laid out, Fort Lauderdale had grown itself a second geography on top of the first, miles of new waterfront, cut in narrow ribbons through ground that had been standing mangrove 5 years earlier. The marketing wrote itself, or rather, it was written for buyers who would never see what they were buying. Full-page advertisements ran in newspapers 1,000 miles from any Florida tide line, selling the new district under a single phrase, the Venice of America, printed in the same typeface as the price. Lots sold by mail. Buyers signed for them off blueprints, brought down on excursion trains for a look, a lunch, and a signature, and the same acre changed hands again and again, to men who owned waterfront property on a Florida canal they had never once stood beside. By 1925, the boom had stopped behaving like a real estate market and started behaving like a casino floor. A canal lot could change hands again in August and again in October, each sale higher than the one before it, sometimes selling twice before the ink on the deed was dry. The ground itself sat untouched through every transaction. No house built, no dock poured, nothing moving but paper, faster than the dredges that had cut the ground it described. Frank Stranahan watched the swamp become an asset class from the porch of the trading post he had built on the river 24 years earlier. The water he had once crossed by ferry, trading in good faith with Seminole families who now had nowhere nearby left to trade from, was selling by the front foot to men who had never smelled the mangroves it used to be. None of the new fingers of land stood more than a few feet above the tide. It was the summer of 1926, and the Atlantic hurricane season, 6 weeks old already, had produced its first 2 storms, and nobody selling lots in Fort Lauderdale was watching either one. Chapter 3. The Storm and the Squadron. By September 18, 1926, the third storm had arrived. It made landfall with sustained winds recorded above 150 miles per hour, tore through Fort Lauderdale, and put the city under martial law within hours. Soldiers patrolled streets where dredged fill had washed back into the canals it came from. Roofs went first, then porches. Then, in the newest of the Finger Island subdivisions, ground floors built only a few feet above the tide line by design, because a few feet above the tide line had been cheaper to dredge than anything higher. Downtown streets that had been dry land 3 years earlier stayed underwater for days, and boats that had been moored along the new Las Olas canals turned up afterward blocks from any canal at all, deposited wherever the surge had decided to leave them. Across the city, more than 3,500 buildings were later counted as significantly damaged, a number assembled afterward from insurance claims and courthouse filings, rather than tallied in the moment, because, in the moment, there was no one positioned to count. The wind did not care that a lot had sold twice in a single week the previous summer. It did not care that the buyer had signed from a hotel room 1,000 miles away. It did not care that the price on the deed was already far beyond what the same lot had fetched back in 1920. Frontage on a hand-dug canal held no more against 150-mile-an-hour wind than raw swamp had, which was the arithmetic nobody selling lots had priced in. Within a few weeks, the boom was over. The excursion trains that had run weekly, delivering buyers who had never set foot on the ground they were purchasing, stopped running. The full-page advertisements for the Venice of America vanished from newspapers as fast as they had appeared 3 years earlier. Canal lots that had changed hands twice in a single week during 1925 now found no buyers at any price. Florida's collapse arrived years ahead of the rest of the country's, years before a stock market crash gave every other American city a single date to point to. Fort Lauderdale had already had its crash. Almost nobody outside Florida noticed. And then, for a while, nothing much happened to that stretch of coastline at all. The flat quiet that follows a bust, when a place simply waits to find out what it is going to be next. What it turned out to be next arrived by way of the United States Navy. In 1942, the Navy opened Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale on land not far from where the dredges had once worked, training pilots in a skill the war had made suddenly essential: overwater navigation. Finding a course across open ocean with no coastline to check yourself against, no landmark to correct by, and no room for a mistake that would have gone unnoticed on land. On December 5, 1945, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers took off from that base on a training flight logged, like dozens before it, as routine. 14 airmen were aboard. Somewhere over the Atlantic, in the middle of the exercise, they stopped transmitting. Neither the 5 aircraft nor any of the 14 men were ever found. A Navy PBM mariner sent out that evening to search for them, carrying 13 more men, vanished as completely as the flight it had been sent to locate. 27 men, 6 aircraft. Not one piece of wreckage from either loss was ever recovered. No debris field, no confirmed wreck, nothing to bury. No cause was ever established. What the Navy could not explain, the public eventually explained for itself. Flight 19 became one of the founding cases of what would later be popularized as the Bermuda Triangle, a name with no fixed border and no confirmed mechanism, attached permanently to the airfield the 14 men had left from, and to the young city that airfield belonged to. By the time the war ended, Fort Lauderdale had lost a land boom to 1 disappearance and 27 servicemen to a second, neither of them explainable by anything the city itself had done. What the city still had, sitting mostly empty through the Depression and the war years, was a swimming pool it had built back in 1928, Olympic size, the first of its kind in Florida. It was about to stop being empty. Chapter 4. The pool fills up. The first people to notice the casino pool were not tourists. They were coaches. And the reason was arithmetic, not scenery. Sam Ingram coached the swim team at Colgate University, a college in upstate New York, where January meant ice on the quad and a cramped indoor tank that could keep a team from sliding backward, but could not make it faster before the season opened. In the spring of 1936, during Colgate's winter recess, Ingram loaded his swimmers onto a train and brought them to Fort Lauderdale, where the casino pool sat 80 degrees warmer than anything on campus and long enough, a full Olympic length, to time a real 100-yard freestyle, instead of a compromise measured out in a tank built for practice, not competition. He was not the first coach to have the idea. He was the first one anyone remembers acting on it. Other programs followed the arithmetic to the same conclusion. By 1938, Fort Lauderdale had turned Ingram's discovery into an institution, formalizing an annual college coaches swim forum that drew more than 300 competitive college swimmers to the casino pool every spring, from programs as far off as the Great Lakes and New England, all of them chasing the same warm water and the same regulation length Ingram had found 2 years earlier. This was not a vacation. It was training. Timed heats, coaches with stopwatches, athletes who had come to shave time off their strokes and would be back on a train north within the week. The swimmers did not travel alone. And that detail mattered more than the meets themselves. They brought roommates. They brought teammates from other sports. They brought friends who owned no swimsuit built for competition and had no interest in a stopwatch, only in the fact that Florida in March was 80 degrees and New England in March was not. After the Second World War, the pattern lost even that connection to athletics. Ordinary college students with no coach, no team, and no meet to attend began making the same trip on their own. Not to train, not to compete, not to answer to anyone with a clipboard, just to be somewhere warm while their campuses were still cold. The forum had opened a door. It no longer had to be present in the room to keep it open. Glendon Swarthout noticed what the students were doing before most of the country did. Swarthout taught English at Michigan State University, and in 1958 he overheard a conversation he was not part of. A group of his own students working out the logistics of a Fort Lauderdale trip down to the gas money and the number of people who could fit in one motel room. He turned the trip into a novel. Where the Boys Are followed a group of Midwestern college women south for spring break, and it sold the arrangement Swarthout had merely overheard to a national audience that had never thought to plan one. Readers who had never seen the casino pool and would never need to, now that the destination had a title and a plot. The film adaptation opened locally on December 28, 1960 at the Gateway Cinema, and it did something the novel alone had not. It gave the migration a name and a destination in the same sentence, playing in theaters far from any college campus that had ever sent a swim team south. Fort Lauderdale stopped being a place coaches knew about and became the place a movie told the country to go. By 1961, an estimated 50,000 college students made the trip, a figure that climbed every spring through the 1960s and into the 1970s, each year's total becoming the following year's minimum. 25 years after Sam Ingram brought a swim team south to find warmer water was no longer the point. The 6 miles of beach absorbing that number belonged, in the plainest legal sense, to the white students filling it. Broward County had purchased a beach for its black residents in 1954, a single stretch of sand set apart from the one the students now knew by name. Without restrooms, without shelter, without so much as a source of fresh water 7 years after the county had bought it. In the summer of 1961, while the spring migration was still climbing toward its next record, somebody on that other stretch of sand decided 7 years was long enough to wait. Chapter 5: The Wade-Ins. That person was Eula Johnson. On the morning of July 4th, 1961, Johnson, a leader in the NAACP's Broward County chapter, walked onto Fort Lauderdale's whites-only beach in a bathing suit, a towel over one arm, and kept walking until the water was at her waist. Beside her was Dr. Von D. Mizell, a Fort Lauderdale physician. Mizell did not send Johnson into the water and wait on the sand himself. He walked in beside her that first morning, and he kept walking in beside her every week that followed. Neither of them broke a law that anyone was prepared to enforce in front of witnesses. And for the moment, nobody tried. The county had owned that beach for 7 years and never once run a pipe to it. The 6 miles up the coast had never gone a single day without a restroom, a shelter, or fresh water. Johnson and Mizell called what they did that morning a wade-in, and they did not do it once. Through the rest of July, they came back week after week, and they brought others with them, a handful at first, then more, until by the last week of the month, close to 200 people were walking into the surf at a beach the law had reserved for someone else. Some weeks it was a dozen people. Some weeks it was closer to the full 200. Johnson and Mizell were there for all of them. The demand was not complicated. It asked for water anyone could swim in, on a beach anyone could reach. Not everyone in Broward County was prepared to let that stand. By the third week of July, members of the Ku Klux Klan had organized a response to the wade-ins. And what they organized was not a counter-protest. On July 23rd, Klansmen planned to meet the participants on the sand, carrying axes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation learned of the plan in advance and stationed agents on rooftops overlooking the beach and in boats offshore. Rooftops, boats. Men watching a stretch of sand nobody in county government had thought worth a restroom, now worth an armed federal presence. The ambush never reached the water. No axe touched anyone that day, because agents were positioned to make sure of it before it happened, not after. It took longer than a season, but the wade-ins accomplished what 7 years of an unbuilt restroom had not. Broward County's beaches desegregated. Johnson and Mizell had waded into the water on a single July morning with a handful of people behind them. The county did not stay divided behind them for long. The county's beaches stayed desegregated after that. The spring crowds kept growing regardless, a separate current moving through the same 6 miles of sand, answering to a set of numbers that had nothing to do with restrooms, axes, or federal agents on a rooftop. 6 years later, the trouble on that coastline had a different shape entirely. In March of 1967, a 3-day standoff between college students and police escalated into a riot on the beach the spring crowds had claimed for themselves. No Klansmen this time, no FBI on the rooftops, just a crowd that had grown too large for the officers assigned to hold it, on a strip of sand that had absorbed every spring for 2 decades without anyone in Fort Lauderdale seriously asking how large it could get before it stopped absorbing anything at all. 50,000 students had made the trip in 1961, the year Johnson first walked into the water. The climb had not paused for a 3-day riot in 1967, and it would not pause again for another 18 years, not until the same 6 miles were asked to hold a number nobody in Fort Lauderdale's government had yet tried to imagine. Chapter 6. The High Water Mark. The number that arrived in the spring of 1985 was not a projection. It was a count, tallied afterward by hoteliers, police captains, and merchants who had spent the week restocking their shelves twice a day. 24 years earlier, the same 6 miles had absorbed an estimated 50,000 students and been called crowded. By 1985, the count had grown roughly 7-fold. Somewhere between 350,000 and 370,000 college students converged on Fort Lauderdale's beach in a single week. That March, a crowd assembled almost entirely by word of mouth, movie reruns, and the memory of a swim meet nobody in it had ever heard of. They spent close to $120 million in that 1 week, most of it inside a half-mile radius of A1A, on hotel rooms built for two and rented 6 and 8 deep, on liquor sold across counters that never fully closed, and on cover charges at bars that had stopped checking identification months earlier. Fort Lauderdale police made more than 2,500 arrests before the week was over, for public intoxication, for disorderly conduct, and for infractions that a 6-mile strip of beach had never needed a legal category for before. Local papers ran the arrest count as a running weekly tally, the way other cities reported rainfall. The businesses lining that strip had shown no more restraint than the crowd they were serving. Hotels along A1A operated at full turnover through March, the same room rented out 3 or 4 times over in a single week, one set of students checking out hungover as the next checked in expectant. The sheets changed just often enough to pass inspection. Restaurants added shifts for the month. Liquor stores added registers. Plywood t-shirt stands that had not existed in February went up in March and came down again by May. A folding table and a cash box the whole of the investment. Whatever restraint Fort Lauderdale's government would eventually find, the merchants profiting from the week had found none of it yet. Picture A, 1A, on a Saturday night in March of 1985. The 2-lane road between the hotel line and the sand has stopped moving. Horns going, a chartered bus from some Midwestern campus stalled in the gridlock, windows down. At the corner of Las Olas Boulevard, the neon sign over the elbow room burns red against a wall of hotel balconies stripped of furniture and packed with bodies, leaning over the railings to watch the street. Underneath it, 3 or 4 songs play from a dozen radios, none of them winning. A stretch of sand built around a swim meet and a warm pool has become in 25 years a canyon with nowhere left to put the cars. The balconies themselves had not been part of anyone's plan. For years already, local ordinances had been pushing the drinking off the open sand and back into the hotels that lined it. No coolers on the beach, no kegs in the dunes. The same restriction repeated piecemeal block by block through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. What that produced was concentration, not sobriety. The same volume of alcohol simply moved indoors and upward onto ledges 8 and 10 stories above the pavement. Students climbed from one balcony to the next along the same wall, dared each other across the gap between towers. Students fell. Fort Lauderdale's hospitals treated the injuries every spring by now, with a regularity the city's tourism board never mentioned in a single brochure. The local papers covered each fall individually, an inside page item easy to miss between box scores and the weather, and the obituaries, less often but not never, recorded what the inside pages did not. By the end of that season, the calculus inside Fort Lauderdale's City Hall had shifted. It was not the arrests alone that did it, and it was not by itself the balconies. It was the sum of both arriving in the same year as a head count the city had never been built to hold, and then, that same year, the mayor of Fort Lauderdale decided he had seen enough. His name was Robert Dressler. Chapter 7. The Uninviting. Robert Dressler had been mayor of Fort Lauderdale for 2 years by the spring of 1985, long enough to sit through 2 seasons of arrest tallies and hospital admissions before the third one arrived and set every record it had left to set. He did not call a press conference in City Hall. He went on Good Morning America, on national television, in front of an audience many multiples the size of the crowd on the beach behind him, and told the country's college students, in language that made no attempt at diplomacy, that they were no longer welcome in his city. It was not an act of political theater dressed up as decisiveness. It was delivered the way a man reads a zoning variance into the record, flatly and once. The city commission followed with ordinances rather than sentiment. Open containers of alcohol were banned from the beach itself, closing off the last stretch of sand where a cooler could sit legally in the open. Overnight parking along the strip was banned next, which meant a car full of students with nowhere booked for the night no longer had the option of sleeping where they had parked. Neither ordinance mentioned spring break by name. Neither needed to. Robert Cox took the mayor's office in 1986 and did not soften what Dressler had started. Where Dressler had made an announcement, Cox built an apparatus. Beach Patrol, once a seasonal detail scaled up for 10 weeks in March and let go for the rest of the year, became a year-round enforcement operation. Officers assigned to the sand in July as readily as in March. A permanent unit built to keep a problem from ever again reaching the size it had reached under his predecessor. Cox would not survive his own political career long after making that name for himself. He is reported to have told a classroom of school children that the only qualifications for the office he held were being free, white, and 21. The remark did to Cox's reputation what the ordinances had done to spring break. It did not require an investigation or a trial. It simply ended something. In 1986, MTV picked a beach for the first live broadcast of its new spring break franchise. It picked Daytona, not Fort Lauderdale, which had spent 30 years earning the association. A swim coach in 1936, a novelist in 1958, a film premiere in 1960, a head count that had climbed every March for 2 straight decades. Not Fort Lauderdale, which still had the hotels, the balconies, the strip along A1A that 100 magazine spreads had already photographed. Not Fort Lauderdale, whose name was, at that point, more or less synonymous with the thing MTV was about to televise. The network looked at a stretch of Florida coastline it needed for a live broadcast, and picked the other one, and the choice took less time to make than most of the ordinances Fort Lauderdale's own commission had spent the previous year drafting. 20 years of identity, decided elsewhere, in a single television season. The hotels adjusted to what their own city government had made of the business. Properties that had once been renovated specifically to sleep 6 students to a room built for 2 spent the back half of the 1980s being sold or demolished or gutted and repositioned toward the guests Fort Lauderdale's tourism board had decided it preferred now. Families booking a week in July, business travelers passing through for a conference, retirees with no interest in a balcony 6 floors above a crowd. The city's marketing followed the hotels. Brochures that had once used the word wild started using the word quiet. A destination that had spent 2 decades selling itself to 19-year-olds spent the back half of the 1980s selling itself to their parents. What Fort Lauderdale did with 6 empty miles of beachfront once the students stopped coming was not advertised the way the students had been. It took most of the next decade to become visible, and when it did, it would not be wearing a swimsuit or carrying a cooler. It would be considerably larger than either. EY Chapter 8, The 6 Miles Again. Fort Lauderdale kept the water. It changed almost everything else. The city calls itself the yachting capital of the world now, a title with about as much official backing as Venice of America ever had, and considerably more money behind it. The Fort Lauderdale International Boat Show runs each fall along the same waterfront the developers once platted lot by lot, and it has grown into one of the largest in-water boat shows on Earth. More than 100,000 attendees, close to $1.8 billion in economic impact every year on a schedule nobody in city government has any reason to cancel. Port Everglades sits beside the same beach the students once filled, and it now does for cruise ships roughly what the boat show does for yachts. In fiscal year 2024, the port processed 4,010,919 cruise passengers, a figure up 39% from the year before, enough to rank it among the 3 busiest cruise ports on the planet. Downtown, more than $12 billion was invested in new waterfront construction in a single recent year. Roughly 70% of the city's residents now live within a 10-minute walk of water that, for most of Fort Lauderdale's history, had been something to drain, dredge, or apologize for. Not every part of that water stayed cooperative. On April 12th and 13th, 2023, a storm system that meteorologists later classified as a 1-in-1,000-year event stalled directly over the city and dropped close to 26 inches of rain in about 12 hours. The water rose fastest where it always had. In the narrow fingers of fill dredged out of mangrove a century earlier, land built only a few feet above the tide line because a few feet had been cheaper to cut than any more, water already sitting on 2 or 3 sides of every lot before a single drop of rain fell that April. By the second morning, driveways on the old Las Olas Isles were indistinguishable from the canals beside them. Cars sat roof-deep a few hundred feet from houses that had sold a century earlier by mail to buyers who never once saw the ground they were paying for. The storm caused an estimated $1.1 billion in damage. A short walk from those same canals, on a bend of the New River the dredges never reached, Frank Stranahan's trading post is still standing. It is a 2-story cypress building gone silver gray with age. Propped on the pilings it was built on in 1901. And it operates today as a museum. Docents leading visitors through the rooms where a general store and a bank once ran out of the same building under the same man. It has outlasted the boom that turned his ferry landing into a real estate listing. It has outlasted the hurricane that ended the boom. It has outlasted the swim meet that started the migration, the movie that gave it a name, and the mayor who went on national television to end it. It is now one of the oldest buildings standing in a city that spent most of a century building things that did not last. The casino pool did not last either. The pool where a Colgate swim coach first found warm water in 1936 is gone, filled in. Its footprint absorbed decades ago into the resort towers that now line that stretch of the beach. The beach itself is still 6 miles long, the same 6 miles where students once slept in their cars when the hotel rooms ran out. 6 and 8 to a room when they didn't. It is raked flat and clean before 9 every morning now. Rows of cabanas, spaced at exact intervals, rent by the hour to guests who arrive by launch from yachts anchored offshore, rather than by chartered bus from a Midwestern campus. In the late afternoon, the light comes in low and gold across the water, the same light that used to catch a wall of hotel balconies stacked with bodies leaning over the railings. It catches cabana canvas now, snapping in the onshore breeze above a stretch of sand that has never once cared, in any of its incarnations, who was standing on it. The tide still comes in twice a day, the same as it always has.